Hello and welcome to Public Access America. This is Just the Tip. How about you, Marko? You got
Good
any
advice.
Just the Tips for us?
Well, I'll give you some of my grandmother's ancient wisdom.
I love grandmothers.
She said, if you want to be a good person, you have to do a good deed every day, no matter how small it is. So try doing that.
I love that. I'm going to say eat some chicken or eat some eggs, and then go and listen to Audio Pong, the podcast you can find on Spotify and Apple and anywhere else you find your favorite podcast. And now you can find Marko here on Public Access America.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope we can do this again. I look forward to the next one.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
We're going to bring in different perspectives and have these conversations all over again. That's what I love doing.
It's fantastic.
Just the tip. Just the tip. Just the tip. Just the tip. Thank you.
It is time now for something positive.
We might be headed to the promised land of speaking the truth and finding our external liberty once we internally liberate ourselves.
Problem can only be solved when there is a kind of coalition of conscience.
Because that is how it works. This is the beginning, it is not the finale, and that's why we're here, and that's why we rally.
We've got to be that creative minority.
Find a way to get in the way. I got in trouble. It was good trouble. It was necessary trouble.
Frankly, I know we've got to do something.
And we're back. That's how easy that is.
Fantastic.
So we can keep
Nice.
talking about the same subjects, but I have a very interesting thought experiment I want to throw into the mix. And then I want to ask Jeffrey about something that happened this week. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
All right. So we're going to imagine that a violinist falls into a coma, and the music industry, the music community decides that this violinist can only survive if they're attached to somebody else for 9 months. And during the night, the music community comes into your bedroom and attaches this violinist to you. And you wake up. Is it right? Is it wrong?
This is an interesting one, and
Yeah, I just wanted
I'm
people
gonna go
to
with-
like think of it. You don't have to answer. I just wanted people. And then Jeffrey, if you want to go on and can you tell me what the fuck happened with Judge Alito's opinion? Can
All right,
they
well,
just
let's-
say nuh-uh and get away with it legally? So all of that in one, and then I'm gonna let you guys speak while I step away for a second, if that's okay.
so I'm going to go back to the thought experiment, just because this is a really interesting one, and it has a lot of connotations well beyond just this idea that you can attach a violinist to a person and that they live. Medically, we have the ability to keep people alive damn near indefinitely, which just the reality is that our cells entropy, our marrow entropies, and eventually we cannot replace those cells. Now we've found out that there is a way, and what's crazy is that it's frightening what you could actually do, in that you could actually reverse aging by implanting bone marrow from a child into an adult, because that fresh bone marrow allows a person to regenerate newer, younger cells. You can effectively age backwards by doing that. Now, you want to talk about ethics and morals, that's pretty fucked up. And I don't think that there's any way that you can convince me otherwise. But to go back to having to attach to a person, it's a quality of life issue. And I think quality of life is a huge issue when it comes to everyday people. Now, growing up on a farm, you're surrounded by death, whether or not you want to think about it, whether or not you want to view it. You have animals that you're selling to be slaughtered. You have animals that get sick and die. You have animals that are predated. You have animals that grow old and live happy and healthy lives from one end to the other, and that's the end of it. For me, when I look at this, I see a quality of life issue. Much like, one day my dog's going to get old, and if I'm lucky, I will get to help them pass as peacefully as possible. But the reality is that most people, most animals, their life is a rather violent end, because it's usually, your heart stops, your lungs give out, your organs explode, and you meet a very painful demise. Not all of us get to say, you know what, I'm going to sleep, and if there's another side, I'll see you when I'm there. In this way, what you are doing is you're keeping a life alive for selfish reasons, not keeping a life alive because they want to be kept alive. And that selfishness is what prolongs suffering.
Well, I think quality of life is definitely where we sort of hang our shirt in the argument, because I'm the type of person, I would agree, actually, first of all, with most of what you said. I think the quality of life is what needs to be considered. I also think it's important to be rational about what the limits of quality of life can be. I think it's treated as sort of limitless, as if there's just this utopia that we could grant each other somehow, but there aren't. There's peaks and valleys to quality, and we certainly can't reach the peaks, but we seem to be convinced we can, because we seem to hit the valleys quite easily. But that said, it's where I usually argue, like even in the pro-choice or in the abortion debate, is that it seems often enough to me that the quality of life of the mother isn't even taken into account. Everybody's thinking about the soldier that could be, the voter that could be, the orphan that could be, even though somehow that is automatically equitable. But I don't think it is, and I think that I agree. I think it's a very selfish thing, because I also think quality of life. What is a person? What does it mean to be a person? What does it take to be a functioning person?
Yeah.
Someone made an argument once. I forget the scientist's name. He's like, we believe we can prove mental damage. So if you suffer a concussion, or you're born with a disability, it may be permanent until you die, or even get worse. And so we know that the brain can be damaged in so many ways that are irreversible. And yet at death, that is all somehow repaired, and we can now fully function our consciousness again. That's a wonderful thought. If it was true somehow, or we could prove it, I think that would, of course, change the argument. But we have to live with the evidence that we do have. And yeah, the quality of life needs to be considered. So it does. I mean, does that mean, well, then, hey, do you agree with, what level of euthanization do you agree with? Like, how far can it go? As far as I'm concerned, I think even a person who suffers, and you all remember Dr. Kevorkian. I don't think that what he did was unethical. Maybe in part it could be argued, because he was the first, celebrity of that type of, let's call it science, or ethics. But I do agree that even because I believe in that level of liberty that the individual should have. I don't think you should be able to kill yourself because it was Orange Tuesday instead of pineapple, but you should have a control over the level of your quality of life when it comes to the amount of suffering that you have to manage, that you have no control over, at which point the only control is death, if you want to look at it that way, which I do. And I think that can be applied even to unborn life.
Agreed.
Having been suicidal in my youth, I would say that in my youth, I probably would have said, absolutely, let me choose to die when I want to die. But having gotten better, I wouldn't say fully. I mean, I have my mental health issues still. It's, I'm not suicidal anymore. And I have my good days and my bad days. There are certain lines and limits, but at the same time too, I also understand that, having lost a friend, that they didn't want the doctors, they didn't want the medication, they didn't want the friends, they didn't want the therapy, they didn't want, the commitment to a psycho ward. the reality of when a person chooses that it's done is really tough on everybody else, but it's not tough for the individual if they're there. If you have paid attention to the news, there's a 22-year-old cheerleader, I forget where she was out of, who just ended her life, and she just couldn't do it anymore. And to me, the biggest crime in this isn't, people tried. And I mean, this is the reality that everybody needs to understand. Yes, do what you can to keep your friends alive, but at some point, there is a pain that we're all going to feel when that life separates from us, and we view it as not their time. And unfortunately, without knowing how this individual took their life, I can only assume that it was violently, because there are very few peaceful means for someone to pass on their own without violent help, be it medications or firearms.
Yeah.
What makes this difficult is that the people around her are suffering because they didn't see it as her time to go. And you think about it, 22 years old is, with no other, no terminal cancers, organ failures, things like that. It's really tough to understand the concept that this person just was done. They couldn't do it anymore.
Well, I think the worst thing about depression is not that you feel bad, but that you have hope you won't.
Right.
And it's that lingering that poisons you.
It does.
Yeah, I can relate. And I agree. I think it only goes back to what you talked about, or what we talked about earlier about perception. That's what essentially I think we're trying to do when we try to help someone, is change their perception. You can't do anything if they don't perceive things differently, as far as I'm concerned.
You can't. And a therapist told me once when I was going through therapy because of my own issues, and once when I was going through therapy after a friend that I lived with for 4 years took his life, you can't help someone who doesn't want the help. And that was the difference. I didn't want to kill myself. Realistically, I did not want to do it. I just, like you said, there was the hope that I wouldn't feel anything. I wouldn't feel bad anymore.
You don't want to take away the option in the conversation, in the thought experiment,
And so when I finally found that I could feel a different way, absolutely I wasn't ready to give up on being alive. But for that person who, my dog's barking, but for that person who can't see that, who can't find that, who either has tried everything or is completely unwilling to, what do you do? It's this is a tough one. It's not like somebody who's terminal and it's like, look, I'm either going to die violently on my own, or I'm going to die peacefully on my own accord. And that's what makes this so difficult, and then you have the existential question of, does a person with depression, is that the ultimate fate? That we don't want to believe that a person who is struggling that badly is going to die violently on their own, much like somebody who has a heart attack or organ failure or cancer. Because we want to think that we can change a person's mind in some way, shape, or form, whether it's cancer, whether it's therapy, whether it's medication, if there's a chemical imbalance, or if there's something physically wrong that's causing this issue. We want to think that there's some way that we can change that.
Sure, we hope. We always want a magic wand if we can get it, but it's just not the case. I read a book once on toxicity, as it relates to our relations with people in our lives, and I think it relates to your thought experiment here, because the level of sacrifice we make is dependent, according to this author, on the amount of time we invest our emotions into someone else. And so you can reach a point where you quite literally care more about someone else than you do yourself. And it's very easy to use myself as an example. What I struggled with through most of my life was liking myself. It was very difficult. It was very easy for me to jump in front of a bullet, let's say, for somebody else, like a stranger, but I had no care for my own. And it wasn't necessarily always a degradation. Like I didn't beat myself up over it, but I certainly did sometimes. And discovering a way to like yourself, man, that is like a brand new day. That changes everything. And that's usually what I think I'm trying to do now.
Or that you don't have to hate yourself before other people discover why they should hate you, right? Like
even that, it's funny you mentioned that.
You see your flaws, and we know other people are going to see them too and judge us for them. So we want to like knock our self-esteem down to prepare for that. But it never happens because people don't see our flaws necessarily as flaws, you know?
Well, most people don't care, right? You have to tell yourself that. They just don't give a shit.
Right.
So it's get over yourself. We used to have a cone when I worked in construction with this mini, safety cone on the dashboard.
Yeah.
And I used to keep it there. And I would tell my boss, I said, that's our therapist. And so his boss one day he said, what the hell is that? I said, that's our therapist. He's like, what do you mean? I said, well, when you're having a bad day, you shout at the cone. You tell, you complain, you get all your angst out. And I said, eventually you reach a point where you feel silly because you're shouting at a cone. Then you get over yourself and you're fine.
Right.
He said, oh, I need a cone.
Absolutely. And that's the thing is like we learn to develop tools in various different ways. For me, it's anything from baking and playing music to, sometimes I just really get trapped in my own head and I just have to fucking muscle through it, and I have to, it's like, what you're feeling is stupid. Is it really though? Well, why do you feel that it's stupid? What are you really feeling? What's actually happening? And for people who haven't had the time or the ability or the resources to learn those tools are going to struggle more than if they had heard, for example, having a cone on your dashboard.
Well, people have always been told to muscle through it and not to lean into it. But once we lean into it, like I said, we examine it for what it is, like what Marko just said about the cone. You're yelling at a cone. Once we start analyzing the depression we're in, we're like, there's nothing fundamentally analytically correct about this. There's no rationale for the depression I'm in. And so you still feel that, but it happens less because you go into an analytical perspective about a depression. For me, like I used to have anxiety attacks, but I learned to think about what I was going to cook, divert my attention while still analyzing the situation. You know what I mean? And that's how I normalized it. It was it's like, is that a ghost? That might be a ghost. That's not a ghost. It's a shadow. Is it a shadow? Why is there a shadow? It's a light. I thought about it. There's no ghost. I'm not scared. Right?
Well, the mind hates wasting time. So once you reach that point, once you convince your mind that you're wasting time, it's out.
Right.
The problem seems to just go away.
Right. But I think what was interesting about that thought experiment was that, yes, there is a right to life, but that life isn't necessarily entitled to the means of survival. Right. Like Marko, you said something very important to me, and it's kind of the track I wanted to go on was, when did we stop thinking about the mother who constitutionally has this word life in the Constitution, protecting
who was a person first,
protecting them?
Yeah.
And currently is what I know is life isn't exactly life until 20 weeks. So we have that time. We never had a debate about when life is life. And I'm happy to have that life, that this debate at some point. Judge Alito bypassed that. But it's just, there's a separation. The mom has a right too, right? To liberty. Liberty is like not being oppressed. And so we deserve options that contain abortion, just like we contain nose jobs and boob jobs and abortions. These are things that we shouldn't be oppressed with. If we want to fix our lives or change our lives, it's in our power to do that, right? And then the pursuit of happiness. Those are the three. Judge Alito said abortion isn't in the Constitution, and I think it is when it says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, I mean, definition, that's open-ended. I also think that as far as I lost my thought.
Sorry about that. I just
no, what you said was profound, and I wanted to because I totally agree with what you just said, and I wanted to point out the fact that no, I
you
lost
got
the
it.
thought.
That's what we're here. We're for thought.
Yeah,
right?
it'll come back around.
I just think once you determine that the fetus is alive, then it's not the mother's responsibility necessarily to keep it alive. It's for whoever wants to keep it alive if they want to keep it alive. But
now you remind me what I was going to say. I suspect that it's less about ethics and more about politics and economics, really, when you get down to it, because population control is that's a really big topic. It's probably just as varied as economics, and they go hand in hand. And I'm definitely not smart enough to really be analytical about it, but that's my suspicion, my conspiracy, is that it had very little, maybe, in fact, to do with the emotional bondage of life, and more to do with what that life can produce if it is allowed to grow.
Okay. Like black and brown people disproportionately suffer more during abortions than white people do. So we're going to race to the bottom and hope the white people survive.
I'm not sure I understood that. Yeah. I didn't get that.
Well,
what do you mean?
Black and brown women suffer more deaths during pregnancy than white women. So if we eliminate abortion, even in the terms of a mother's rights, then more black people will die if we get rid of abortion than white women. So it'll be a race to see who dies faster.
Is that because, what is the cause of that, though? Is that because more black women are impoverished or at a level of life where they have less access, like globally, or is that more of a Western society statistic?
It's an American thing for sure. And a lot of doctors are taught to dismiss most pain, and so they just dismiss black people strangely more than others. It's documented, and I still don't know quite why it would be that a black doctor would dismiss a black woman's pain more than a white woman's, But we've talked about that.
It's like the whole discussion is really interesting, and I wish I had more information. To be able to talk about that.
We will get some more information and talk about that in a show. But can you talk about? Did you read Judge Alito's opinion at all? Is there anything like legally valid in there that we can start to discuss, or was it all religious and eugenics?
Here's the problem with
thank you
much like the way, unfortunately, gay marriage was decided. Abortion rights are decided in the same way. You didn't have the right until the Supreme Court ruled in a very narrow and very specific manner that you did have a right. The problem is that as cases come up and as new modalities come up, those modalities can challenge the overall ruling. So this is where I have my greatest concerns, having worked in the legal world. The problem with any law, the problem with any ruling is that it is in effect until it is nullified by the Supreme Court. Oftentimes we think of the Supreme Court as, oh, well, if they've ruled on a case, then it's absolutely settled. The problem is that people are very much blind to the fact that just because the Supreme Court rules on something, that doesn't mean that they can't turn around and rule on it in an inverse later. I mean, you look at slavery. Slavery was constitutionally legal, and it took a lot in order to get slavery to be illegal. But even then, constitutionally speaking, it actually is still legal, whether people want to admit it or not, and it's part of the 13th Amendment. So you have that to consider. With this ruling, essentially what they said was that the grounds in which it was decided was beyond government reach. And the way that and basically you have to understand the way in which, Roe versus Wade or Planned Parenthood versus Casey was decided was that in a very narrow window, they said, yes, It is not, government is not to create an undue burden on, is what the ruling really was. The problem is that the government left it vague. They left it very vague. So what you have seen are a number of different challenges to those laws. What does an undue burden constitute? And what you're seeing in this ruling is that because the way that they're trying to push that is that, what each state can define as an undue burden should be considered, not what the feds should consider it as. And I happen to disagree with this, even though I'm very much a person who believes that, there's a lot of things that states should be able to decide for themselves. The problem is that this is something that stems beyond a state, and I believe that it needs to be a federal law.
Part of the Constitution, right? Like an amendment to the Constitution.
Something to that effect.
Ideally, if not a law, and if not a law that can be overturned by a Senate majority later,
Right. And the problem you're going to have with a law like that is that you will never get enough to get a constitutional amendment.
No, you need 37 states, and right now there's only 22 that would uphold abortion rights.
Yep. And so that's the problem. And essentially is that what people viewed as settled law, when you have 26 states on the books that will actively ban it, you wouldn't even have enough to prove its constitutionality based on what states are doing. I happen to disagree vehemently with that. But what I also happen to disagree with is the method in which we try to create these laws. And this is something that Jason, you and I have talked about before. But I do believe that in certain cases, it requires direct democracy, i.e., the American public should be voting on this.
Yes.
And it shouldn't be up to the state. It shouldn't be up to the House of Reps. It shouldn't be up to the Senate. It shouldn't be up to the president. It shouldn't be up to the Supreme Court. If the majority of Americans, and in a case like this, I would say 2/3.
Right.
If 2/3 of Americans said abortion needs to be legal and accessible on a federal level, then it would not give way for Supreme Court justices or
politics,
the president or the House or the Senate or even states to argue whether or not this is legal.
Right.
This is the will of the people, and you cannot ignore it. And so that is one of our biggest problems I see fundamentally with our democracy is that we vote for representatives, we vote for senators, we vote for presidents. We don't vote for justices necessarily. We vote for them by proxy.
Right.
But we do not vote on major issues that impact Americans directly. And I think that is problematic. And I think that is one reason why not only are you seeing a challenge like this to Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, but you're going to see this prop up again with gay marriage. Texas is already looking at a way to, quote unquote, settle laws is that, children of immigrants are to be educated in the American system. They're already challenging that. And so the thing is that all it takes is a specific enough case to completely overturn something that was considered settled law. And we've seen this happen in good ways, but also in bad ways too.
Yeah, every time we win, they see it as a loss.
Well, how do we escape tribalism?
Right. That's what we're trying to get past is the tribalism to a consensus opinion.
Well, do we want to escape tribalism though? You could argue that many aspects of tribalism are conservative and therefore they protect things that don't change, right? Points of view or even perceptions of reality or science, let's say. I get that. I can understand that. You mentioned direct democracy. To me, that's a really slippery slope from, again, my amateur point of view. I don't think there's a lot of good things that I've heard about that or read about that, having at one time being a history buff. I'm trying to give like good example, but unfortunately I can't.
Yeah, there's a
From
lot of
my
state
experience,
referendums, like
yeah,
in
it just seems like,
California, the you can get gay married if you're gay law and all of that. Those were referendums in states, but I don't know any national referendum that's.
Well, I wonder too, like, does every
But I love the idea, but how would you word it? Because the referendum would become law, so you would have to tailor it. Who would tailor that? And
well, that's what I was going to get at, was like, when it comes to civil liberties, I mean, just to give you an example, like, I think nothing is more important than free speech. I think everything depends on free speech. That is the core of liberty. So to me, that is a liberty that should be defended federally, nationwide. Perhaps, I mean, really, I believe globally, but maybe and this is kind of devil's advocate, but maybe there are liberties that are defended more locally at a state level, because I feel like we operate more. There's a term, feudal oligarchy, and I think we operate, really, that's what I see our society as, is a feudal oligarchy, not really a democracy or even a republic, because it is. I mean, the kings of gold, let's say. I'm getting analogical, but the kings of gold, they make the rules. So they're the ones that create the pressure that we have to live in.
Right.
They also are responsible for managing our society, whether we want them to do it or not. They are doing it. So you could say the world is run by villains, but it is the villains that are keeping things together too. So I don't know really where I stand when it comes to things like, well, first of all, morally, marry who you want. Again, if you want to bathe in olive oil and watch Mr. Rogers backwards, I don't care. That doesn't hurt anybody. But your pursuit of happiness, I think, to some federal level, should be defended. I mean, at least you should be allowed to do things that don't harm others.
Right.
You want to have a gay marriage? Great.
Right.
You want to, maybe two transgender people want to, I don't know, maybe they want to switch back and forth, depending on what decade it is, and then get married. I don't care. I think that's fine.
As long as there's mutual consent involved. Somebody can't marry an animal or a child because there's no consent.
And here is where things get fun. All right, let's talk about consent, because this is going to be fun. Who do we say is capable of giving consent?
To what?
Can you define that?
Yeah, that is an important question, right?
In what situation?
Who is in any situation? It doesn't matter. Who is capable of giving consent?
Well, in terms of abortion, or in terms of pro-life,
just in general. Just in general.
Well, we decide we decide what and who and when is allowed
legally. What is legally though? What is the definition of consent?
Oh, I don't know the legal definition of consent.
So the legal definition of consent is anybody over the age of 18 that has their mental faculties, that is capable and unhindered to give consent or confirm a transaction. So who can give consent? At 17, you cannot give consent, but at 18, you can. At 17, you can't.
You said if you have your mental capabilities and you can consent.
Nope.
Yes.
Nope. 18 plus.
18 and mentally disabled.
This is legal. Exactly. So they don't have their mental faculties.
Exactly.
If they're 18 or older. But at 17, for example, you cannot consent.
Right.
Now, states have come up with different ways around that for different things.
Ew, why?
You can consent to different things. Like, for example, you can't get beer and cigarettes, but you can definitely, have sex with a 30-year-old man at the age of 14. Looking at you, Arkansas.
Gross.
So how does that make any sense? So if children can't give consent, like in a legal court, you can't sign contracts.
Right.
You can't do any number of things. You legally cannot consent.
Right.
So now let's look at what abortion looks like in terms of consent. You have one party who is not consenting.
Right.
So why is it okay to violate their consent?
I think that's the problem. There's two parties. That's the real problem.
But even still, it doesn't matter if one party consents and the other party doesn't. That's not consent.
True.
That's not consent.
if we were a nation solely of party and not of people. Like at some point,
Well,
like popular opinion.
when I say
has to
party,
be-
I'm talking individuals. I'm talking legal, what the legal definition of parties, not the political definition of parties. So one person consents, one person doesn't. It doesn't matter. There's no consent. That would, if you could rule based on that logic alone, rape wouldn't exist, for example, because one party consented.
Well, unfortunately, to some people,
Wow.
that is how they
You took that.
consider
Exactly.
You lost me all the way until the end of that, and now I'm just intrigued. But a woman's going to get an abortion whether the father agrees or not, if she wants to.
Now that's where once again, going back to my roots, the act of banning things doesn't work. You're not removing the thing that you claim to hate. All you're doing is making
works.
you're just
History
making it
proves that all the time.
Exactly. And so the difference here is that if one party doesn't consent, why then should another party be able to force and enforce something that doesn't? There are very few things in life where we actually make the exception. So, for example,
and that's a perspective-driven argument, because I'm looking at it from both perspectives, going, well, yeah, why could the Democrats make me consent? And then I'm looking at the other perspective, like, why should they make me not? Why are they taking my right? Why can't like you can see that, and you can form an argument just based on that alone. And I don't think you have to do all that. There's a mother, a father, a baby, and a discussion, and they should have any option in that situation.
Now, here's where this gets interesting, because in the legal world we talk about remedy. What does remedy look like? So this was actually a discussion that we had in the house, and this was a really tough one. For example, if two people decide that they're going to have a baby, great, there's consent. If the father doesn't want the baby, but the mother does, we don't think twice about it.
Right.
The father can't force the mom to get an abortion.
Right. The father doesn't have a violinist attached to him for 9 months.
So when you think about that, here one party may not consent to having the kid, but there is no way to force that other party to not have the kid.
Exactly. Everything has a right to life, but it doesn't have the right to the methods to sustain it.
In this case, the remedy, there are a couple of ways that this gets remedied. Number one is, obviously, a lot of people hear about the child support methodology, which is dad's not involved but pays because, takes two to tango.
Is that accountability?
Accountability. The other is in the legal world is you forfeit parental right. And so, while the child was quote unquote fathered, the child never has a father on record of birth.
Oh no, don't take away my responsibility.
So basically, what you have is a remedy in this case where the child can be born, but the responsibility doesn't have to be born. Now, you have the inverse. This is the toughest one. You have someone who fathers a child, who essentially has what they see as a right to that child, and this is where Planned Parenthood versus Casey comes in. But you have a mother who doesn't consent to that. In technological terms, there is no remedy. You either have to force a person to carry the term, or you remove that life. And that's where this gets tough. Technologically speaking, we're only in like the very, very beginnings of artificial wombs, where you could potentially
mention that actually.
You could potentially have that issue of, the mother could abort the child, but in order to do that, there's a medical way in which you do this that gets implanted into an artificial womb.
We don't throw away the mass of cells. We keep it in a artificial status. And the woman then denies her parental rights along with the.
But they brought up a conversation about
that.
States being able to own babies, basically, and what type of citizen would they create? Would they have the same rights? It almost sounds like slavery in some kind of dystopian future.
Now, exactly. Now here's where this gets difficult. Is that what does remedy look like? And the answer is that you would have to force someone to go through what is a very violent procedure and very traumatic in order to sustain that. No different than, people like to think that, abortion is just like, people are just going in and it's a walk in the park.
Yeah,
It's
why do
still
they
a very
think it's
violent
like a
and
fun
traumatic
tea party
experience.
or something? That's an invasive procedure that leaves people sore and crippled for days.
So this is one of those things where it is a very, there are people out there that are much brighter minds than I am. I can only speak to the legality of what I see and what my experience is. And I'm sure that there's a ton of legal minds out there far better than mine. The real answer is that, in this case, there is no remedy. And even if there was a remedy, that remedy is still very violent and very intrusive and very traumatic.
Well, that's why I wonder if it is a liberty that is better defended by a state, because then at least the parents or parent have the option of leaving the state they're in that doesn't protect them or agree with their choices to go to one that does.
Wish they did.
So now let me put this into perspective. Let's remove the term abortion and put the term slavery in place. By this regard, slaves could have just left slave states to go to free states.
Yeah,
it's no different. You're establishing underground railroads to get person to a freedom that is defined in another state.
I wouldn't say that's synonymous at all. Actually, I think the variables comparatively are hugely different. I mean, we're talking about, first of all, a slave and a modern mother, have two different levels of rights. I mean, you're an American citizen no matter which state you go to as a pregnant mother. The difference of being a person and a slave, that is a far more dramatic difference.
I think it is less dramatic than you think it is, because if you are forced to carry to term, wouldn't that constitute a form of modern day slavery?
Yeah, because you're attached.
No.
You have a violinist attached to you.
Your job is to produce that life and produce that life only. Nobody gives a shit about you before or after.
No, it's not the same, because you have a choice. So the very fact that you have that freedom to move, just being able to move around, I think, is
now here's
taken for granted.
I disagree, and the reason I say that is because in a state like Washington, we have the ability to openly access those clinics. But if that mom from Texas does that in Washington, she will be arrested and charged with murder the moment she goes back to Texas. That's no different in my mind. If you're going to go back and the first thing that's going to happen to you is you find yourself in violation of the law and are thus going to be locked away. We did the same thing. We did the same thing for people who ran away from their slave owners.
There would be a bounty on both, right? A runaway slave and a runaway mom at that point.
There is.
But then
states had no.
You're also saying, without saying it directly, you're saying that the value of a slave, because that is the reason why a slave is important at all, is because they have economic value, right?
Production value, yeah.
And that's why, and that's what they're saying about with the mothers. The mother has a productive value to have that kid in order to do whatever it is the state wishes that be done.
Yeah.
But that conversation is being held silently, right? There's no one admitting to that. That's my point.
Nobody is saying this is slavery on a mother.
No one wants to equate a human life to them having a not necessarily a social score, but essentially a social score, a productive value, as you put it. And they don't want to do that because it does relate in the term in the example you gave to slavery. So I think that's a distinction that, to me at least, stands out pretty prominently.
Well, I will agree, and I want to say that if you cross the Mason-Dixon line as a slave, you become a whole person. But when you go back, you're 3/5 of a person, and I think that's what Marko was debating the issue of.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could also bring up the point too that slaves that did escape to what they called free states, they weren't American citizens.
Right.
They were
Undocumented.
free slaves, which was its own distinction, its own category. It had its own explanation of that, had its own limitations and rights as well. They couldn't just walk in and have the same luxuries, let's say, as white people or people who weren't slaves.
And then, and I think that, looking at it through a historical lens, the difference is that if we were having this discussion in 1865, we would be hard pressed to find any differences, because women didn't have those rights. Didn't matter if they were white, black, or brown. The difference is that we have time, and we have legal rulings that have allowed the perception that that all of those women now have those rights, into whatever state line they cross. And so that's where I say it is comparable. It's not a 1-to-1, but trying to look at it through the eyes of 1865, it very much would have been a lot closer. And applying that now, it is a lot closer. It's very uncomfortable to think of it in that realm. Yes.
Yeah, boy, this should be its own podcast.
This is, and here's the thing is
to think about. I'll tell you.
I would love to have a black woman have this discussion with us, because we know that when it comes to abortion and abortion rights, black and brown women are disproportionately affected.
Well, and yeah, I mean, that's what matters really to me, is what not necessarily the statistics, but what is the data, what is the real life experience of people that do have to deal with these things. I mean, look, my argument is, if it isn't historical, it's philosophical. I'm a middle-aged single man. I've never even had children myself, so I can only argue for the personal liberty of someone and try to be rational about it. So I agree that I think it's definitely one of those topics that maybe as you said, we've come a long way. We've established a lot of laws that have introduced a lot of new freedoms, which are good things. But maybe we're close to as perfect as it can be. I don't know. I think only the future will tell us that, and we'll see. Because I mean, how many more good decisions can we come to? When you said, like the example you gave, when you look through anything through a historical lens, yes, it's far more stark. I mean, it's black and white. You could say it's a no-brainer. This is the more moral thing to do. But we are no longer at that point. Yes, if it was 1865 still, we wouldn't even be discussing the rights of women. That wouldn't even, I mean, we laugh over a cigar maybe. Even if I was born in that time, I can't say habitually, morally, I would be a different.
If you weren't a landowner, you wouldn't even be voting,
Right, exactly. So
that's why it's difficult to have these discussions, and it is difficult to compare. But when you look at function, and you look at the way things functioned, you can see more comparisons than you want to realistically admit. Even in the news, there have been discussions about, people there are organizations out there setting up essentially, means for people to leave these states to make it to other states. That sounds way too familiar to something else historically that we already know and learn about in the history books.
Well, it's repeated. It's been done before as well. It happened in the late 80s, and it happened in the mid 90s, in like 94, 95, I want to say. That was something that was like a fearmonger piece of news I saw recently, was bringing that back up, basically claiming that, religious conservatives are going to be attacking doctors to perform abortions again, even without having a case to represent any actual occurrence. I think that kind of thing is unfortunate, to just cause fear in general. And I don't really think we should worry about threats that aren't threats yet, even though history does repeat itself. But
for me, my realm, though, like where I work, is risk, and I have to think about this stuff all the time. The idea that you don't worry about it until it happens is not something that, at least in my line of work, I get the opportunity to afford. I have to plan for what that risk is, and when that pops up, I need to have any number of game plans that can mitigate that response. And I guarantee you, all of these states now are going to be coming up with those game plans.
Sure.
Whether it's acceptance, or means of jailing, or any number of different possibilities.
They've already jailed somebody for having a miscarriage in Texas.
Yep. And then they also the prosecutor declined to prosecute it.
Yeah, that's what we're finding out in Michigan is
Right, yeah, why would
prosecutors
you-
are standing
why
up
would you
and saying we're
prosecute
not
that?
going to prosecute it because the Supreme
Yeah.
Court has no army to enforce their means. Like that thing that got leaked, they have nobody to investigate it, but they're going to investigate it using some I don't know what they're called, but they're not they're security. They're not investigators in the Supreme Court. They have no way to enforce their stuff.
Right.
But what I hear
And
you
also, leaking
saying,
isn't illegal.
what I hear you saying about this is that much like executive orders, we've been using Supreme Court decisions to prop up the failures in our Constitution, and that we need to work on. After ERA, we realized we couldn't get an amendment added. Something as simple as equal rights for women couldn't get 37 states. So we just dropped that, and we no longer thought about getting amendments for abortion rights or anything else, or gun rights for that matter. Yes, you have the right to possess and own bear arms, but you don't have the right to own a gun because abortion isn't in the Constitution, and neither is the word gun. So we have to be careful about this slippery slope that Alito is forcing on us. But we need to do the hard work of building a consensus to amend a really ancient article that we live under, that people live under, but others live above. Let's say that.
Yeah, I think that's why I disagree with you, Jeffrey, about direct democracy. I feel like maybe you do come to the conclusion of a direct democracy that's favorable when you do it at a state level. When it builds up, it evolves into something federal. I mean, isn't that essentially what we do now?
Yeah, that's what we always,
a lot of things.
We always talk about community rights, and I always believe that something should be started as simple as in a homeowners association and build into the local community, and then other communities see that, represent that, and like you said, then suddenly it's if
it has real traction,
right, then it's a popular idea. Like green energy is popular, people are fighting it, but even Skill went green, so it's something that's being popularized, and that's how consensus grows.
Maybe we should worry about the things that work against the growth of good things too, though.
Well, I mean, everything naturally gets pushback. It's just if it's good for the community or not. And that's for the community members to see,
That's free speech.
I just want a representative that represents his district. So if that district is radically Republican, then by all means be that. You know what I mean? But come to Congress rational. And you have to interpret your community's desires, and you can't do that if they're not talking to you. So,
well, that's the number one thing I think that I run into, at least with the demographic of people that I'm surrounded by, is that they want people that stick to their guns. That if they're going to represent a series of ideals and beliefs, they need to represent them and defend them. When they're wrong, things can be adjusted, but just to change their mind because it gets them the support they want, that is completely immoral as far as I'm concerned.
That's where we lose our democracy, is when in a town hall meeting, the mayor says, I'm going to do what I want anyway, and then we lose a little bit, and then that grows. And I don't care if Matt Gaetz, I hate Matt Gaetz. That's who represents me, Matt Gaetz, right? And my issue isn't that he's yelling about some stolen election. It's the fact that he hasn't gotten me any budget for new roads. He didn't vote to get me new bridges. He didn't vote to get rid of this dump smell in my state, in his district. That's why I have a problem with Matt Gaetz, is because he hasn't listened to us about what we need,
Yeah.
So I don't know. You're lucky.
That's a fun one.
You have great representation. Where are you, Marko? What state are you in?
I'm in Illinois. I'm not far from you guys. I'm near Chicago, a suburb of Chicago. And I've lived here most of my life. I'm planning to move. I actually favor the Southwest.
No.
Just because I like out there's more space, and I feel like people bump heads a lot less. And really, I'm not a political person, not in the sense that I would pursue it. I'm an artist. I'm a lover, not a fighter.
Me too.
Unless they ever invent professional logic wrestling because I'm pretty aggressive and competitive. But other than that,
Yeah.
I think that's where I love logic wrestling. Like, I love someone who challenges my way of thinking, and I love, I think that's definitely what, one of the things I love about Debbie is that Debbie always challenges the way that I think about things, and fuck, it's frustrating, when they beat me in a logic game, but it's also fun because in the end I still get to learn something. There was one night Debbie and I, we were going back and forth with each other, trying to paint each other into a logical corner to where the other couldn't escape. We were getting really heated and really animated, and our oldest came down crying because
you were fighting.
They thought we were fighting, and that we were going to end up getting divorced. Meanwhile, the two of us were having fun. It's like, I got you this time, motherfucker.
My mom used to debate me on stupid things, and then when I would win the argument, she would take my side and start arguing. Like, she took the winning side and left me with the losing side, and then I would have to debate that till I won that side before I could leave the house.
Oh, I did it very often with my father, because I would argue until he became aggressive, and then I would just completely agree 100%, and I would just paint how ridiculous his point of view was. Unfortunately, it shuts people up when you do that. So
yeah,
I'm not sure if you get to him or not, if it made any sense to him, but
yeah, they never did this logic wrestling, this logic.
It will win you a debate. I'll give you that.
Yeah, but it won't win you friends, will it?
It might. Yeah,
it might.
Yeah.
I like being the stupidest person in the room. It's a lot less responsibility to learn than it is to teach,
Oh, I mean, with the way this world is, bring me back as beautiful and stupid, please. Yeah. I'll sign up for that.
I like that. So let me ask you guys. I'm going to start with you, Jeffrey. Do you have any just the tips this week?
Take a mental health day if you need it. Like, seriously, this is one of those things where I think it's really important. We get used to the go, and we oftentimes think, oh, I'll deal with it after work. I'll deal with it after I make dinner. I'll deal with it after I get the kids to bed. I'll deal with it tomorrow. And if you don't if you have something that absolutely you need to take time for, take that mental health day, because otherwise you're not going to have the time or the space to actually work through those things. And it's something I'm trying to learn how to do myself.
How about you, Marko? You got any just the tips for us?
Well, I'll give you some of my grandmother's ancient wisdom.
I love grandmother's ancient wisdom.
She said, if you want to be a good person, you have to do a good deed every day, no matter how small it is. So try doing that.
I love that. I'm going to say eat some chicken or eat some eggs, and then go and listen to Audio Pong, the podcast you can find on Spotify and Apple and anywhere else you find your favorite podcast. And now you can find Marko here on Public Access America.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope we can do this again. I look forward to the next one.
Definitely. We're going to bring in different perspectives and have these conversations all over again. That's what I love doing.
It's fantastic.
To those who would tear the world down, we will defeat you. This is our moment. This is our time. To those who seek peace and security, we support you. Yes, we can. And to all those who have wondered if America's beacon still burns as bright, tonight we prove once more that the true strength of our nation comes not from the might of our arms or the scale of our wealth, but from the enduring power of our ideals, democracy, liberty, opportunity, and unyielding hope.
Let me tell you something you already know. The world ain't all sunshine and rainbow. It's a very mean and nasty place, and I don't care how tough you are, it will beat you to your knees and keep you there permanently if you let it. You, me, or nobody is gonna hit as hard as life.
Ask not.
Yes, we can.
What your country can do for you.
I have a dream.
Ask what you can do for your country.
My poor little children.
Yes, we can.
One day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression.
In this lifetime, you don't have to prove nothing to nobody except yourself.
But it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep moving forward.
That's how winning is done.
Welcome to Public Access America.
Yes, we can.
Sunday live streams on YouTube.
I wanted to run out of that tunnel for my dad.
On Twitter,
What?
Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Smart Radio
Public, and Spotify.
Yes, we can.
Public Access America. History in the making. Making history in the making.